Today, the Transform MEP Interest Group launches its charter with recommendations for EU cooperation to enable safe and timely access to advanced therapy medicinal products, so-called ATMPs. The charter is the product of our work for the past 2 years, together with experts in the multi-stakeholder Transform Alliance, to identify the barriers faced by the patients to access the ATMPs and to propose concrete solutions to those barriers at EU level. We want to ensure Europe remains an attractive environment to invest in innovation so that the patients can have early access to these innovative therapies.
MEPs represent a new era of medicine, having the potential to change patient lives. MEPs offer the hope of moving from chronic treatments that manage symptoms to long-lasting benefit, or even one-time treatments which can be potentially life-changing. However, our healthcare systems need to be more patient-centric and prepared to receive the revolution so that the cell and gene therapies are accessible to patients across Europe. Adequate incentives, a future-proof regulatory environment, appropriate pricing and reimbursement processes, and innovative access pathways are key. The Commission's ambition of a strong EU health union must reflect the present voice in all decision-making, so that access to the best standard of care is not limited to the few. With the review of the EU pharmaceutical legislation, now is the time to act for the changes that are needed to make sure no European is left behind in the fight for better quality of life. We now introduce our 7 recommendations.
I fully endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, in particular the recommendation to create a dynamic, patient-centric innovation ecosystem to address areas of medicinal need. The development pathway for ATMPs must reflect the needs and perspectives of patient and caregiver throughout the life cycle. From how clinical trials are designed, to how evidence on ATMPs effectiveness is generated and how this is taken into account in value assessments. More collaboration and early iterative dialogue with effective involvement of patients and healthcare providers, as well as universities, developers, payers and research centres, will support the appropriate identification of development priorities for tomorrow's therapies. Underpinning this must be an attractive environment for clinical trials and an adequate incentives framework, encouraging developers to invest in R&D in the European Union. More clinical trials in Europe for ATMPs will mean patients can assess these treatments sooner, with the potential of improved health outcomes.
Hello. I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, and in particularly welcome the recommendation to define appropriate regulatory requirements for the development of ATMPs. ATMPs are complex therapies requiring skilled production, assessment, distribution and administration. A robust, proportionate regulatory framework must be in place to safeguard patient safety and confidence in innovative treatment options. The current proposal for a regulation on substance of human origin must preserve consistent and harmonized definitions for the classification criteria for blood, tissues and cells, keeping a clear boundary with ATMPs, which are far more regulated. The forthcoming revision of the general pharmaceutical legislation must support this clear distinction. We call for more transparency and consistency around the use of the hospital exemption across the member states. With EU oversight via regulatory guidelines on quality, with equivalent standards for use, and a central European register for transparency on its use. All patients deserve safe, quality treatments, and the EU must ensure all medicine developers are subject to same proportionate surveillance.
I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, and in particular the recommendation to consider the use of real-world evidence to address uncertainties for ATMPs. Due to the nature of ATMPs as well as practical and ethical limitations, traditional pathways for clinical data collection are not always a feasible approach to generate robust and appropriate evidence. Real-world evidence as well as patient-report outcomes are therefore important when assessing ATMP's efficacy over time and can contribute to the implementation of outcomes-based agreements. The proposed European health data space is a crucial opportunity to ensure relevant data can be safely collected, shared, and used for this purpose, whilst always upholding the privacy of patients and their families. Ensuring data interoperability and setting standards for health data sets is vital to ensure it can be integrated into existing systems. The EU should also consider a dedicated EU fund for real-world evidence collection to help build the infrastructure needed to support the role of real-world evidence in the full life cycle of ATMPs.
I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, in particular the recommendation to realise a European health technology assessment system that supports safe and timely patient access to advanced therapies, also known as cell and gene therapies. The new EU regulation marks an important milestone in cooperation between Member States on health technology assessments, which are assessments of the effectiveness, value and impact of new medicines. The hope is to reduce duplication at national level and get these innovative treatments to patients faster. As the regulation is implemented in the coming months and years, we must ensure that the promise of more streamlined reviews in the EU is fulfilled. Cell and gene therapies will be one of the first categories of new medicines subject to EU assessments under this new and very promising regulation indeed, starting in 2025. Given that cell and gene therapies are complex, specialised medicines, the EU assessments must use appropriate methodologies that recognise their unique characteristics. All relevant parties must be involved in the processes outlined in the regulation to ensure this new piece of legislation is fit for purpose and improves the time to access for patients.
I have the pleasure today to support and endorse the Charter of the European Alliance for Transformative Therapies. All these recommendations are of course essential, but I wish today to highlight one specifically. Our call for greater sharing of best practices on newborn screening, testing and diagnostics. For many conditions, especially the rare and complex ones, time to diagnosis and treatment is a matter of life and death. Whilst rules around screening and testing are of course a national competence, we do need European guidelines on newborn screening, genetic testing and diagnostics. These guidelines should be included in a much needed and wider European action plan on rare diseases, which the Parliament has tirelessly been asking for. The European Reference Network's expert platform for newborn screening could support this work and position the European Union as a central point for information, for sharing good practices from existing national programs. A concrete, very concrete example of European solidarity in action to the benefit of all.
I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, in particular the recommendation to promote new access pathways to support sustainability of healthcare systems. Finding new ways to work together as Member States in pricing and reimbursement, which is a national competence, requires new ways of thinking to unlock access for more EU citizens to ATMPs. Existing regional collaborations provide constructive lessons on how member states have cooperated in a range of areas like horizon scanning, health technology assessments, and pricing and reimbursement discussions. We call on the EU to support national governments to share learnings on novel payment and risk-sharing models and funding approaches for ATMPs. We ask our colleagues in STOA, which is the Parliament's panel for the future of science and technology, to consider undertaking an assessment of the possibilities for de-risking investments in ATMPs, for example, via pay for performance and risk-sharing agreements between developers and payers. Moreover, for many ATMPs, administration will be in a small number of designated centers, meaning patients will need to travel for treatment. The importance of cross-border cooperation, including by optimizing the use of the Cross-Border Healthcare Directive, is therefore clear.
I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, including the recommendation to improve infrastructure and enable cross-border patient access to transformative therapies. We need to develop mechanisms to facilitate access to cross-border healthcare. For example, by making national access points easily accessible for patients to get information and treatment options for cross-border care. We also need to remove the burden of upfront payment for patients wherever possible. And finally, EU financing could also be used to support travel expenses and translation services where needed for patients and their families.
You can download the charter from Transform website in transformalliance.eu. We hope this is the start of the conversation on how we can continue to build a Europe where patients can access the therapies of tomorrow, regardless of where they live or their financial background. We welcome other interested MEPs on this charter and to join the Transform MEP Interest Group. Moreover, we call on colleagues in the European Parliament and other European institutions to take these recommendations on board in the forthcoming legislative reviews, building a healthcare system that is fit for the future for all patients in Europe. Thank you for your support.